Snot and stars are not often mentioned together, but on the night our story begins both gleamed across the north. A slow aurora folded like green silk above a fjord. The tide breathed in and out like a sleeping animal, and a young Viking named Odd stood outside the longhouse with a wool scarf, a wooden spoon, and a nose that had chosen the coldest month of the year to become a river. He was not the tallest in the village nor the strongest, though he could lift a barrel when properly motivated and once outran a goat that held opinions about his boots. People called him Odd the Snot because nicknames in the north were rarely subtle, and Odd accepted the title the way he accepted the weather, with patient shrugs and extra handkerchiefs. He mended nets for elders, watched the smoke for changes in wind, and learned the secret music of oars slicing water. Yet the world had prepared another lesson for him that no elder in the hall would have dared to teach. It arrived with a tremor like a drum rolled by thunder, a crack in the quiet, as if the sky itself sneezed, and then a stranger stepped out of a shiver in the air as casually as a fish sliding from one current to another. He was vast and green, a mountain with shoulders, eyes lit by storms, breath like a forge in winter. The ground noticed him and adjusted its worries. Sheep reconsidered their life choices. The longhouse doors leaned together and whispered knots of prayer. The stranger was a wanderer between worlds, a thing of clenched lightning and unspent words. Where he walked, the earth remembered. The elders had not carved a rune for him, for no rune in their set spoke frankly enough to explain the color of his skin or the size of his hands. Children hid behind the whalebone fence, peeking like otters. Odd did not hide. He lifted his scarf, wiped his nose with the dignity of a king drying a jewel, and spoke in the calm voice of someone who has lived all winter with a kettle that whistles only when scolded. "Welcome," he said, "to a coast that values quiet. May your feet be warm and your anger cool by the time the moon stands over the ridge." The giant, who had tasted many names and outgrown most of them, narrowed his eyes, as if the word quiet were a challenge. He pounded one fist into his open palm and wind jumped snow on the eaves sifted away like flour. The villagers took one round step backward in careful unity, which is how you retreat without admitting it. Odd took one small step forward. From the longhouse came the smell of fish soup, barley bread, and tar on oaken beams, a home recipe for patience. Odd held out his spoon as if it were a scepter and declared that the village would offer hospitality before they offered fear. The green wanderer growled a question the way glaciers ask questions, slow, heavy, and without punctuation. "Why should I not smash your boats and make a necklace of your timbers?" Odd sniffed, considered, and answered that smashing boats was boring after the second or third one, but sharing soup was an adventure with endless endings. The giant tilted his head. Adventures interested him. Rage was his winter coat, too heavy for certain rooms. Odd continued in the unhurried style of bedtime. There would be trials to suit the evening, 3 in number like good stories, unbalanced like a stool. The first would be strength, because it is polite to let the obvious go first. The second would be patience, a tool more secret and more useful than a hammer. The third would be listening, which can move mountains that do not respond to fists. "Win 2 of 3, Odd said, "and we will grant you the title Guest Whale of the North, with all rights and responsibilities. Lose 2, and you must join us for the night and attempt the ancient art of falling asleep without breaking anything." The green wanderer bared his teeth in something that was not a smile and not entirely not a smile. He agreed, though the fjord complained in pebbles when he nodded. They went to the shore where kelp drew cursive on the sand. For the trial of strength the giant lifted a boulder that had never in its life been told what to do, and now it learned obedience as it rose like a pie crust in hot vows. He hurled it into the air. It came down where no one was, which is the politest place for a boulder to land. Odd applauded. Then Odd took a longship by the prow and, with a hoof and a wobble and a breath, through his leaky nose, slid the hull 3 handspans higher on the pebbles, so the tide would not steal it at midnight. No one pretended that this equaled the boulder toss. "Point to the giant," the elders said. The sky agreed, with a cold blink of starlight. The children sighed and consulted their pockets for comfort crumbs. Strength had spoken, and it had used the giant's voice. For the trial of patience, Odd invited the giant to wait for a kettle to boil without touching it. They sat on a log like to Hills, who had decided to try being furniture. The kettle thought about its life choices. Steam gathered as if telling a secret. Odd folded and refolded his handkerchief into cranes, boats, and an approximation of a goat. The giant watched the water with the gaze of a cliff, then frowned and tried to assist it by growling. The water remained unimpressed. He stamped one foot, the log groaned, the kettle rattled like a caged bee. The elders muttered that patience could be a loud thing in some species. Odd hummed a lullaby his mother had traded for a basket of apples one warm year, and in the humming the kettle remembered its duty and sighed into a boil. Odd poured tea into 2 wooden cups and bowed to the steam. The giant reached for his cup with too much speed and broke the handle. "It is the way of handles to be mortal," said Odd gently. The giant snorted, which extinguished 3 torches and moved a small cloud approximately east. "Point to Odd," the village declared, and the aurora seemed to write yes in a bend of green. The third trial concerned listening, not only hearing, which goats do well, but the work of letting another voice inside without setting the furniture on fire. Odd asked the giant to hear the fjord the way a fisherman hears it at dawn. First came the lap and hush of small waves, then the pebble chatter beneath, then, if you were patient, the old conversation between tide and moon, one that had been ongoing since before either of them had learned to pronounce their own names. Odd breathed with the rhythm he had learned, mending nets. Inhale on the tie, exhale on the pull. The giant tried. His breath came like avalanche. He tried again. He closed his eyes and felt, for a heartbeat, the cold joy of stillness. Then somewhere in his chest a storm kicked open a door and the moment shattered. He roared, and the roared echo came back from the cliffs with an opinion. Birds leapt into the sky like spilled ink. Listening had not been defeated, but it had been delayed. The elders consulted the rules. Odd, because he was kind, proposed a tie-breaker, a trial not of muscle or stubbornness, but of sleep. "Sleep," said the giant, as if tasting a foreign fruit. "Sleep," said Odd. "The art of putting down the weight you do not need and keeping only the kind that holds blankets in place." The challenge would be simple. If the giant could fall asleep in the longhouse without breaking the roof, he would be called friend of the fjord and may return when his road needed a quiet place to begin again. If he could not sleep, then by the old laws of guests, he must carry firewood for every house until the moon changed, which seemed unwise for a person who wore anger like armor. The giant accepted. The village found a place for him near the hearth, shifted benches, persuaded beams that they would not be asked to do anything heroic, and stacked pelts. Odd set the kettle again. Children crept closer in bravery measured by inches. The aurora folded and unfolded, as if reading itself to sleep. Odd began the slow work of bedtime, as if he were a blacksmith forging a sword from warm rain. He asked the green wanderer to breathe with him for slow counts in, 6 soft counts out, the shape of a tide. He counted stars through the smoke hole, where the sky peaked like a shy guest. He stirred the air with a story about a river that found the sea by listening to stones, about a fox that learned to read snow, about a ship that sailed to an island rumored to be a cloud and returned with a reef of mist. The giant listened as iron listens, unwilling, then curious, then hot with its own transformation. Odd remembered that his nose had enlisted for this mission without asking him. A tickle grew, northern and inevitable. He tried to ignore it. The sneeze prepared its banners. Odd turned away and sneezed with the force of 9 small whines. Candles bowed. The fire danced and then, sensing the tone of the room, settled into a friendlier shape. The giant blinked, then laughed once, an awkward sound like thunder practicing. "You blow worlds from your face," he said. "Only dust and whirring," Odd replied, "and one stubborn crumb of barley bread." He offered the giant the scarf, not as surrender, but as a treaty to the chill between them. The giant, unused to gifts that were not weapons or warnings, took it as a scholar takes a problem and examined its weave. Wool remembered sheep and hillsides. It carried the smell of heather, smoke, and the pocket where Odd kept small shells because small shells felt like answers. The giant wrapped the scarf around his huge neck as if it were a law he had decided to obey. He breathed again with Odd. In, gently. Out, out, out. As if setting heavy stones down in a well. The room adjusted to the rhythm. Even the rafters settled. Children put their chins on their knees and went wherever children go when stories turn them into boats. The giant's shoulders lowered a finger's width, which for him was the distance between winter and mercy. Odd told one more story, the kind that wears soft shoes. It was about a little boy who feared the dark until he learned the dark feared being misunderstood. He learned to greet shadows like travelers and to make tea for worries until they were too relaxed to complain. The giant's eyes softened, which frightened no one. He remembered a door in himself that always swung open to storms and very rarely to anything else. He placed a heavy hand, carefully, on the floor beside the fire, as if apologizing to it. Odd offered the wooden spoon. It was a good spoon, sanded smooth. The kind that knows porridge and can mediate disputes between stew and salt. The giant took it and held it like a tiny oar, and the motion of his breath became a boat crossing a lake at dawn. Around them the village radiated small comforts, a cat piecing itself into sleep on a bench, embers arranging themselves like quiet cousins, a kettle deciding it had done enough for one evening. And then it happened, not like a thrown spear, but like snowfall, gradual, complete, forgiven as it fell. The giant's jaw unclenched. His hands forgot the shape of fists. The green storm in his chest lowered its flags. He fell asleep, not loudly, not like an avalanche. He slept like the first log placed on a new-built fire, content to be exactly what it was. A peace spread out from him, as if he were a stone dropped in a lake that had decided to be kind. The longhouse exhaled. Odd exhaled. Outside, the aurora wrote a new sentence where the old one had ended, and the fjord agreed to keep the matter quiet. In the morning, the village found that none of their boats were necklaces, and most of their fences were still where fences believe they belong. The giant woke with the politeness of someone entering a room where tea is already poured. He looked at Odd, at the scarf, at the spoon. He was smaller, not in height, but in the way trouble sometimes remembers it is a guest. "What do I owe you?" he asked, and his voice no longer knocked snow from roofs. Odd said that the village kept a simple account. One good night of sleep for one promise. The promise would be to walk more softly in places that were not built for storms, to try listening before lifting boulders, and to remember the scarf when the old anger felt lonely and wanted company. The giant accepted. He stepped outside into morning light the color of fresh iron. Children gave him a fish-shaped charm carved from driftwood. The cat allowed him to exist. The elders, brave, bearded, and absolutely new to this situation, declared that the trials had been honorably settled, and the title Friend of the Fjord was granted with unanimous relief. The giant bowed. Bows are strange on big frames. He looked like a barn learning yoga. And yet there was grace in it, the clumsy grace of someone trying to put down a burden that had convinced him it was his spine. Before he left, the giant hesitated and pointed at Odd's nose, which had resumed its watery commentary. "Does it always do that?" he asked. "Only when the north reminds it to," Odd replied. "It is my weather vane." The giant nodded as if given a rune that unlocked a new door. He tore a strip from the edge of his own garment and tied it to the longhouse beam, a green ribbon promising return under better skies. Then he stepped toward the place in the air where the world had wrinkled the night before. He paused again. "Thank you," he said, and the words were so careful that even the gulls accepted them. Then he was gone, and the quiet returned to its ordinary duties. Life continued. Gnats were mended. Bread rose. Snow reinvented itself hourly on the roof. People who had hidden behind fences the night before emerged with the particular heroism of tidy aprons. Children practiced sneezing with stern concentration, hoping to produce whines of their own. Odd, now called odd the soothing by those who preferred results over accuracy, set about cleaning the spoon and hanging his scarf, where the smoke could tell stories to it. He did not claim to have defeated a giant with strength or wit. He admitted that fate had pressed a hand to his back, and that sometimes the bravest thing is an offer of tea. Yet in the drift of winter days, word spread. Sailors carried the tale the way gulls carry news, and beyond the winters and walls of that coast, strangers repeated it with edits. Some said Odd tamed a thunder god with pepper. Others said he wrestled the giant for 3 nights and turned him into a broom. The village shrugged and went back to chores. They kept the truth like a coal under ash, warm enough to start a fire wherever it might be needed. On certain evenings when the aurora folded itself like a letter only the sky could read, Odd would stand by the shore and practice the tide breath. In for 4, out for 6, his heartbeat writing small notes in his chest. He would remember the weight of the spoon in the giant's hand, the way a jaw unclenched could change the weather of an entire room, the important work a scarf can do when it decides to be a bridge. He would remember that defeat does not always mean broken spears and fallen walls. Sometimes it means teaching a storm to sleep, convincing it that rest is not surrender, but a door into a daylight that behaves. He would remember that the body carries old battles in places the I cannot see, and that kindness, when practiced with precision, is a craft as exacting as shipbuilding. And he would smile, and he would sneeze, and the fjord would answer with the smallest of waves, as if applauding with a single hand. If you are listening tonight with a blanket over your feet and the window breathing a thin song, you can borrow Odd's trials. Strength will say its easy piece, first let it have its applause and then invite it to sit down. Patience will fidget and spill a little water, teach it to wait by example. Listening will begin as a challenge and end as a room full of comfortable chairs. Then add the last trial that the elders forgot to carve because they assumed it was obvious: sleep. Breathe as the tide breathes. Count the stars by the chimney. Tell a story about a fox or a cloud or a spoon, and let your jaw be the first wall that falls. If your mind roars, offer it a scarf. If your heart stamps, offer it tea. If your worries crowd the doorway wearing horned helmets, widen the door with laughter. You do not need to win the night by force. You need only persuade it that peace is more interesting. Odd grew older as people do who prefer steady work to drama. He taught children to fold handkerchiefs into boats. He taught elders a recipe for barley soup that included a story at the beginning and a nap at the end. He taught anyone who asked how to breathe as if the world had all the time you needed, because often it does. Some nights, when the wind was in a certain mood, he felt the world thin beside the old whalebone fence, and he would leave a cup by the gate, just in case a wanderer needed warmth. He never said for whom. He did not need to. The scarf hung on its peg and held the smell of wood smoke and the faintest trace of a giant's winter. If you pressed your ear to it, you might have heard a heart the size of a house learning how to be a guest. That is how a snotty Viking defeated the Hulk, if defeat is the right word for a storm that learned the language of sleep. It was not a victory measured in trophies or in songs that frightened birds from rafters. It was measured in a longhouse roof that did not break, in boats that remained boats, in a village that went to bed. It was measured in a giant who discovered that gentleness is not a desert but a harbor, and in a young man who learned that his smallest breath could be a bridge between worlds. And now the aurora has folded its silk, and the fjord has closed its eyes, and the kettle has decided there will be no more announcements this evening. Lay your head where it is welcome. In for 4, out for 6. The tide is already doing the counting for you.